Welcome to On the Porch, the podcast. Thanks for joining us. Wiley Cash is the New York Times best-selling author of A Land More Kind Than Home, This Dark Road to Mercy, The Last Ballad, and now he's written the new novel, When Ghosts Come Home. He teaches fiction writing and literature at the University of North Carolina at Asheville, where he serves as alumni author in residence. He lives in North Carolina with his wife, the wonderful photographer Wiley Cash, and their daughters. His work has received the Southern Book Prize, the Sir Walter Raleigh Award for Fiction, the Weatherford Award, the Crime Writers Association's Novel of the Year in the UK, the Thomas Wolfe Book Prize, the Pat Conroy Legacy Award, many other honors. You can find his writing in magazines such as The Oxford American, Garden and Gun, Bitter Southerner. I could go on, but I want you to hear from him. Wiley Cash, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you for doing this with me, Silas. I really appreciate it.
Well, why don't you tell us about the new book?
Well, my new book is a departure for me of sorts. It's my first novel that's set on the coast of North Carolina. We moved down there in the fall of 2013. And both of our daughters were born there. We have a 7-year-old and a 5-year-old. And my wife, Mallory, who you mentioned in the introduction, was raised there. And I was not. And that place had always felt very foreign to me. And I just decided, if I'm ever going to know this place as well as my family knows it, I need to write about it. And so that was one reason that I set it down there. It's also a departure for me in that this is a real mystery. It's kind of a real whodunit. And I've kind of been thrown about as a mystery writer or a crime writer in the past, and this is, I think, the only real example of either of those. So I'm a little more comfortable with those titles. But the book is set in the fall of 1984. It's set off the coast of North Carolina on a little island called Oak Island. And it opens one night when a middle-aged sheriff is awakened in the middle of the night by the sound of a low-flying aircraft. And he knows there is no good reason for a plane of that size to be coming in this late to an airport this small. So he drives out to a little darkened municipal airport, and what he finds out there changes the course of his life and the course of the life of the people in this small little coastal town.
Great setup. You've already got our attention there. So I know the novel is being billed as a literary mystery. So have you always been a fan of mysteries?
I think so. I don't seek them out. I don't necessarily seek out any particular kind of genre, but I've always thought of mystery writers as being very smart, very cerebral, very aware of their own work, and that's not at all the kind of writer that I am. I'm a really messy writer. I have to edit a lot at the end. I have to make a lot of cuts, and so I've never fashioned myself a mystery writer because my first 3 novels, some folks called them mysteries, but they were mysteries to the people in them. They weren't mysteries to the reader.
Right.
Because the joy for the reader, hopefully, was when are all the characters going to have the information that I have and what's going to happen when they do. So it wasn't a mystery for the reader. This new novel is definitely a mystery for the reader. You have to wait until the end to see how all of these parts come together and to kind of make sense of all these reveals. So I didn't set out to do that, and it surprised me when I did do it. But nonetheless, I felt very smart after it happened.
So you didn't grow up on Agatha Christie the way I did?
I did not, and that's a major, glaring spot in my life as a reader. I didn't grow up reading a lot of commercial mysteries. I think I would be a better plot writer had I done that, and I need to go back and make amends for that.
Well, I just find it most interesting because, as you alluded to, there is always a real element of suspense in all of your work. That propulsion is there in all of your novels, even if they're not straight up mysteries. So you just must have a natural flair for that.
Well, I think that what I try to do is create relationships between the characters where there is some measure of suspense based on withheld information, bruised egos, hurt feelings. I mean, think about, you get in a fight with your spouse. Think about how much on the phone. Think about how much suspense there is in that lonely car ride home before you walk into the house and confront this person that you've given your life over to. So suspense kind of it can be garnered and like stretched out and embellished in so many ways that don't involve the more traditional things we think of, like, bomb explosions or hostage takeovers or alien landings and things like that. I mean, our everyday involves so much suspense.
Yeah, it's sort of that notion that life's biggest dramas take place in the bedroom or in the kitchen, right?
Absolutely.
I really believe in that, yeah. I think the thing that's hardest for me is, you work on a novel for years, and sustaining or pacing the suspense throughout the novel. I mean, a novel that's going to be read, in a few hours by the reader, yet you're spending years on it. Can you talk about how you sustain suspense and pacing and things like that for yourself? How do you have a beat on that while you're writing the book?
Well, pacing is something that I think about more consciously after I've written what may be closer to the final draft of the book. But keeping myself at the desk and keeping myself engaged over however many years it takes to complete a novel, there are two things that do that. First is financial desperation. I got to get there to the end because right. That's how we make a living. And then second is always feeling like I don't completely know my characters and they're going to do something that surprises me, or they're going to react in a way that disappoints me. And knowing that these people are, as much as I've created them, they're also people who have come into my life the way that everyone comes into my life, which is just by happenstance. They just happen to pop into my mind or my heart, and then I kind of round off their sharp edges and make them feel more real. But I'm always curious about my characters. I'm always, sad when they do things I don't want them to do, and I'm always happy when they surprise me. And so I think that's what really keeps me sitting there. And going back to the stuff about plot and mysteries, if it was just the satisfaction of tricking the reader into not knowing the twist in a mystery, I don't think that would sustain me over the years it takes someone like me to write a novel. I think it's really those characters that keep me at the desk every day.
Yeah, I think that's the key to, that's what makes a really great mystery is when it's character driven, when it's when attention is being paid to the language, when it's not just just about the trick or trying to keep the reader from figuring out who it is. So I know that you've accomplished that. Well, I just finished a novel that involves a sheriff as a main character, and I found I had to do a tremendous amount of research to get all of that right. What was that like for you, especially since it's set, 30 years ago, 40 years ago?
Yeah, 1984. Yeah, it's daunting when you realize in reality how long ago that was. It's historical fiction, although I think of stuff set yesterday as historical fiction because you still got to get the era on the page. But the stuff about police work that did take a lot of research of asking around. There's also a few characters who are FBI agents. The FBI gets involved in this downed aircraft. And I was very fortunate that I had a reader who had contacted me and just, hey, like your book, da-da-da-da-da. I'm a former FBI agent, da-da-da-da. So I reached out to this guy, and he helped me in so many ways. He was an FBI agent that investigated drug planes in the Deep South in the mid-1980s. And so he was invaluable. He said, when we showed up, this is what we had on the first day. This is how we acted. This is who we suspected. Mm-hmm. This is how we treated the local authorities. This is how we opened the investigation. So that stuff was just endlessly valuable. And it's amazing when you are in the midst of a project and your heart is open to your characters, and every conversation you overhear and every book you read is somehow synthesized into an approach to what you're working on, how those little moments of magic reveal themselves. You need a specialist in hot air balloons, and you just happen to meet a specialist in hot air balloons. That stuff just happens. I mean, you've experienced too. It just happens.
Yeah. This is Silas House. You're listening to On the Porch here on WUKY 91.3 FM. I'm talking to Wiley Cash about his new novel, When Ghosts Come Home. Well, can you talk a little bit about the racial element in the book?
Sure, yeah. One of the things, the sheriff finds two things. He goes out to the airport and he finds a crash-landed DC-3. It's a World War II cargo plane. It's sitting sideways at the very end of the runway, and the rear landing gear has snapped off. And when he finds the aircraft, it's completely abandoned, and it's empty, and later they will not be able to recover any fingerprints from inside the aircraft. What he also finds is more troubling. It's the body of a local man who's been shot dead and left alongside the runway, and this man's name is Rodney Bellamy. He's in his mid-20s. He's a young black man. He's become a new father. His wife has moved up from Atlanta. He has returned home after college, and he is the son of a local history teacher at the high school, a man named Ed Bellamy, who kind of serves as the county's de facto civil rights leader. And so, it's the mid-1980s. We're at the height or at the beginning of the war on drugs, the DARE program. We have all of these cultural influences, the crack epidemic, and all the racialized language around, welfare queens and City on a Hill and Ronald Reagan and Jesse Helms. And our sheriff is locked in a pretty tough reelection battle against a local guy who's the son of a wealthy developer who's got money to burn on a campaign for sheriff. And he sees an opening to inject some really divisive, racialized politics into the campaign. And so race takes center stage as a result of the opportunity that the sheriff's challenger sees to drive a wedge between himself and the sheriff. And so, this area, coastal North Carolina, Wilmington, Brunswick County, has an incredibly violent history in terms of, the end of Reconstruction with the race massacre of 1898 in Wilmington, which is the only successful coup in American history, violent school desegregation. And so all of those things come to build on the cultural memory that all of these characters are inhabiting in the novel, and how they perceive one another, how they trust or do not trust one another, how they see themselves as helping or not helping people in their lives.
Well, especially over the last couple of years, we have rightly so been going through a reckoning in our country about race. Of course, we have a long way to go. But while you were writing the book, millions of people were marching in the streets for George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and a national conversation was really happening. And I'm just wondering, how did that affect the writing or the revising of the novel, if at all?
It definitely did. It definitely found its way. None of us write in a vacuum, and it definitely found its way onto the page. And some of the sentiments of the characters, of course, I was thinking about Ahmaud Arbery just being suspected as, a criminal just because of the color of his skin and the neighborhood that he was in. Right. And that's very much the case with the young man who's found on the runway. He's just suspected as being involved in a drug ring. And so those things were definitely going on to the page. But what was also going on to the page were some of the ways in which myself or other people, whether it's on social media or in, national politics, seem to think that they're helping by doing things that don't require a lot of risk on their behalf. And there are moments where the sheriff, who really is a good person, but doesn't understand the deep-seated power structures of racism in his community, there are moments when he thinks he's doing the right thing, but what he in reality is doing is the easy thing,
right.
Firing a poisoned deputy and thinking that fixed racism in his department.
Mm-hmm.
And the black characters in the novel are like, hey, that's just the fruit. That this tree's rotten all the way down to the core, and just because you can't see the roots doesn't mean that they're not there, And so I was writing about these things, but I was also writing about the barriers to easy understanding of those things across communities.
Mm. Well, like you said, the book is a period piece, although it does feel weird to call, when I was 13 years old, a period piece. But
Yeah.
so I'm wondering, if music of that period was important to you while you were writing the book.
It was. Yeah, it was. My sister is a little bit older than me, and in the mid-'80s, I thought she was the coolest thing going. And so a lot of the music she was listening to as a teenager, I was 7 in 1984, so I idolized her. But, of course, we've got Michael Jackson in there. We've got Pat Benatar. We've got the Police. Joan Jett, David Cassidy, all the major players of late 70s, early 80s music. And there's a scene, another character is the sheriff's daughter. She's 25 years old. She's fleeing a marriage on the rocks and a personal tragedy. And she returns home in the midst of this investigation. And she steps into her old high school bedroom, and there's a beanbag chair, and there's an olive green rotary phone, and her David Cassidy and Joan Jett pictures, and her, Steely Dan pictures, and all the posters and all these things. So that was really fun to kind of step back and recall what some of those bedrooms and some of those pop culture expressions looked like.
Right. It just makes it so much richer, and to bring in those pop culture elements, and somehow it makes it more immediate for the reader, and we can step into the page, I think. Well, I know that you have excellent taste in music, and so I'm wondering what music you've been loving lately.
Gosh, I've been listening to more contemporary stuff than I normally do. One thing, I'll say something about contemporary and something a little bit older. One contemporary band that I've really fallen in love with is a band out of Wilmington, North Carolina called Beta Radio. And it's these two guys that have been friends forever. They're actually from Wilmington, so they're in the town they grew up in, which I think is, I always marvel at people who are doing good creative work in the places they are from in today's age. I think that's just wonderful. And they're an incredibly talented duo, Beta Radio. They make wonderfully touching, sonically nuanced, just really beautiful music, kind of like Fleet Foxes meets Simon and Garfunkel, just really, really beautiful music. And then another great musical experience I had a couple of weeks ago, I went to a film festival and saw a documentary called Rumble. And it's about Native American contributions to contemporary American music, especially rock and roll. It was just a fascinating documentary. One of the best I've seen in years. It was exceptional.
Great. I will look for both of those. Well, what about books? What's the last book that blew you away?
I've really had a great reading year. I'm in the car quite a bit, so Libro FM, the audiobook purveyor, where you can use independent bookstores to benefit them, that keeps my ears full of books. I listened to the love songs of W.E.B. Du Bois by Jeffers. It's stunning. The audio was just glorious. It was so beautiful. Reading-wise, one of my favorite books of the year was the recent National Book Award winner, Hell of a Book, written by my friend Jason Mott, who lives just down the road from us in Wilmington. I read that book back in the summer and did a profile on him for Bitter Southerner, and I just had a feeling about it and tried to tell everyone about it that I could. But those were my two novels of the year that I read that I just really loved. And then another book that I read recently that I loved is about the Cape Fear River. It's called Down the Wild Cape Fear by a writer named Philip Gerard. So I've had a great reading year. We got a couple of days left in the year. Hopefully I'll get more done.
Well, you do so much for other writers. You're always promoting other writers. You started a book club to highlight the work of your peers. Why is that so important to you?
Well, I've been really supported by so many writers, so it's important to me to support others. You know, you supported me from the very beginning. The first time that we met, you went out of your way to be nice to me and welcoming, and have given me opportunities and introduced me to people that I otherwise wouldn't know. And being a writer in North Carolina, this is just such an incredibly supportive state, from Charles Frazier and Ron Rash on the West End to Lee Smith and Jim McCorkle and the late Randall Keenan there in the middle, and Clyde Edgerton and Jason Mott and other writers there in the eastern part of the state. I mean, it's just such a wonderful place to be a writer. And I feel like all of us work alone so often that anytime we can get together and support one another, it makes us all better and makes us all more interesting.
Yeah, North Carolina has such a great writing community, and it really does. I always brag on Kentucky's writing community. And I always say we really like each other, and I feel like North Carolinians are that way as well. So it makes for such a great community when it's that way. This is Silas House. You're listening to On the Porch here on WUKY 91.3 FM. I'm talking to Wiley Cash about his new novel, When Ghosts Come Home. Well, why don't you tell us just a little bit about your journey of becoming a writer?
Oh, gosh. So I grew up in Gastonia, North Carolina. I was always a big reader. And I started to kind of write in high school, late junior high, mostly doomy Jim Morrison influenced poems. So girls would like me and find me interesting and believe that I was smarter than I actually was. And I went to UNC Asheville because they had a major in creative writing. And I just thought, how interesting that must be. And I went and realized that Jim Morrison was a terrible poet, and I also was a terrible poet, but I liked writing. And so I started writing short stories. And I never really looked back. I took it very seriously as an undergraduate and tried to get as much feedback as I could from a very supportive writing community and the professors there at UNC Asheville. And then I went to graduate school, and I ended up at the University of Louisiana Lafayette, where I studied fiction writing under Ernest Gaines. And he had always been a huge influence on me. He was the first writer whose work I encountered who talked about old people the way my parents talked about old people, who wrote about land and landscape the way my parents and grandparents wrote about rural spaces. At this time when I was in college in the 90s, I hadn't read Ron Rash or Charles Frazier or you or Lee Smith. I didn't know anybody was doing that. And when I read him, I just thought, oh my God, this is the person I want to study under. And so I was really fortunate that I got to study under him, and we forged a great relationship. And when I went out for an agent, after finishing my first novel, he had already given me a blurb. And that really kind of opened doors for me that probably wouldn't have otherwise opened as easily as they did. And so I signed a 2-book contract. I was very fortunate with my first novel, A Land More Kind Than Home. It was part of a 2-book contract. So even if that novel had bombed, which thankfully it didn't, I would have had another one on the way. And so I've been really fortunate.
Yeah, that's amazing to get to work with Ernest Gaines. I mean, the books he wrote are just so foundational to our literature. A Gathering of Old Men, A Lesson Before Dying, the autobiography of Miss Jane Pittman. I mean, those 3 alone, what a legacy.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And he was a great teacher. He was also somebody who just believed in the work, and he really believed in honing your sense of craft. He believed in actively reading and being engaged with text outside of what you were working on. And I just saw him live that way. and it's how I've chosen to live as well.
Right. Well, you're the father of 2 little girls, and it's very clear from being around your family that you and your wife are a real team. You're co-parents, and so often in the worlds of film, music, and literature, we hear women being asked this sexist question of how they balance being a mother and an artist. And I think it's sexist because men don't get asked that. So I want to ask you how you've managed to write 4 beautiful novels while also being a full-time, very involved father.
It's definitely a balancing act, and I have this idea in my mind that Mallory and I co-parent. I get to go off and do my writing, and she gets to go off and do the photography. But that's not always the case, especially when I've got a novel out and I've got to travel, days in a row on a book tour, which I've been doing recently this year, teaching like I do. But my semester's off. Mallory and I have this mindset we go into called panic work. And it's when you have 2 hours before school pickup or before a doctor's appointment, you've got 2 unbroken hours. How much panic work can you get done in that moment? And so that's something that I really focus on and really try to identify those snatches of time and really try to take advantage of them. But when the semesters that I'm not teaching, I really structure my days around drop off at school, which is at 8:00, and then pick up, which is 2:45. And I really try to get all my work done in between those hours so that when I come home, my kids don't see me. We don't have an office in our house, but my kids don't see me on my laptop at the dining room table, or they don't see me grading student essays in front of them. I really want those things to feel separate. That when I'm with them, I am all theirs. I can read, I can play, we can go on an adventure or whatever, domestic things we have to do, go shop for groceries or whatever. So I try to have those lines of demarcation, but it's hard. It's hard for me and it's hard for Mallory. It's a struggle and a juggle, but we made several years ago when Mallory decided to lean into photography and leave. She was practicing law. And leave that, and I decided to give up a tenure-track job and try to cobble together a career. We decided, this is going to take some intentional living. Those intentional decisions are going to result in more intentional and probably tougher decisions down the road. And they have, but we've always tried to stay clear-eyed about these are decisions that we have brought on ourselves, and I think we're a better family for them.
Well, Wiley, it is always a pleasure to talk to you. Thanks so much for joining us here on The Porch.
Oh, I really appreciate you having me, Silas. It's been great talking to you.
I hope all of you out there will get a copy of When Ghosts Come Home by Wiley Cash. It's available wherever fine books are sold, and it is guaranteed to be a beautifully written and suspense-packed read. We're going to close with some Jason Isbell, whom I know that our guest, Wiley Cash, loves as much as I do. And thanks to all of you for joining us here on The Porch. Until next time, be good to one another. Thanks for listening to the podcast of On the Porch. I'm your host, Silas House. This episode was engineered and produced by DeBron Thomas at the studios of WUKY 91.3 FM in Lexington, Kentucky. We are listener-supported radio, and we thank you for joining us.